Welcome back to the Light and Life podcast, conversations on faith and life in downtown Colorado Springs. I'm your host, Liza, and today I'm so excited because we have our first guest host, Associate Pastor Jennifer Holtz. Hey, Jennifer, how's it going?
Hey, Liza. It's great.
I'm so glad you're here. This is so fun.
Thank you.
I think if you listened last week, you got a little sneak peek at what we'll be talking about today, which is Sabbath rest. But before we dig into it, I was a little curious, why this topic?
Yeah.
What spoke to you about it?
I was thinking about that because Sabbath has always been important to me, but I don't know that I would have been able to articulate that very well until pretty recently. So I was thinking about the family I grew up in here in Colorado Springs. We always had a different day on Sunday. Now we didn't call it Sabbath, but my parents called it Family Day. Like today's Family Day.
Oh, sweet.
Yeah, and so we'd always get up and go to worship here at First Pres, and non-negotiable. Couldn't worm our way out of it. We had to be in worship. We would come to the 8 o'clock service. We'd always be late, which I hated, but we would, come to worship, go to Sunday school, and then the rest of the day was Family Day, which meant we were home, not off doing activities, but eating together, being together, doing house projects. It was always different. We would go out to eat, so my mom didn't have to cook because that was her gift.
That's the best.
Cooked so much. So I was thinking about, okay, so sometimes when you look back to your family of origin, you realize patterns are set pretty early.
Sure.
And so I had this pattern of Sabbath that was set by my family life. And as I look back over my life, I've always had a rhythm at different stages of my life of making Sunday a different day.
That's beautiful.
Yeah. So about 8 years ago, I had to do some intense study on Sabbath. So I had to write a paper, I had to do all this stuff, put together my rule of life, which is just a rhythm for your life, and found out as I did all of that how important Sabbath, the concept of Sabbath, was deeply embedded in me. So I love Sabbath, talking about Sabbath. It's really hard to live it.
Totally.
But it's one of the most, I think, fun things to think about because it's ingrained in us. It's how we're made, is to keep Sabbath. So anyway, That's probably why I'm here, because I love talking about this.
Oh, well, thank you for being here. And, I know many of us listening are likely pretty tired and overwhelmed and live a very fast-paced, overworked life.
Yeah.
So where do we even really start with this conversation?
Yeah, great question. So, Liza, I like to go back to the very beginning, start at the beginning in Genesis, where the first day of rest is established by God. So, God is working, he's creating, and on day 6, he creates humankind. And in Genesis 1 and 2, he gives them a command, what their work is going to be, steward the earth, you know. And so I just imagine, humans hearing that, like excited to be doing their work. And so day 6 comes to a close, they go to sleep, they wake up ready to dig in and start working and discover that actually God is resting, and God invites them into a day of rest with him before they start their work. So 2 things about that. One is that the scripture says that God rested. So it wasn't God just saying, go rest, figure it out, but we have a God who actually rests. He works and he rests. And so they are invited to rest with him, which is key for Sabbath. We can talk about that in a few minutes. But so that's one thing. We serve a God who rests, and we rest with him. And then I think the second thing that Genesis shows us is that rest comes before work. So often we spend ourselves silly work, and then the day of rest becomes recovering from working so hard. But from the beginning, the pattern was rest comes first, and we work out of rest.
So it's interesting that you bring this topic here today, because it's one of my favorites. I know we've mentioned this in the past, but I did the fellows program, and part of our coursework was to write a paper on Sabbath rest. And when I made that mental shift between work being, resting from the week prior rather than like preparing and gearing up for the week after, it caused this switch in my mind of this isn't this is proactive rather than reactive, and it's a beautiful thing. But I'll also say I love when you pair Genesis with this topic, because God's God. If you really think about it, God doesn't need rest. He's God. So why did he create this day? And what I guess gathered was that he did it as an example for his people rather than because he needed to. He's inviting us into that rest with him.
Yeah, I think that's really right. And I think the other thing we tend to lean towards as human beings is to try to be God. And
right.
So it's a reminder that we are not God, that there are limits on who we are and what we are supposed to do, that God is God. Mm-hmm. And when we take a day to honor that and to rest and to remember, oh yeah, I'm not God.
Right.
I have to trust all this stuff to him.
Yeah, it's super trust-based, that I can get done all the things that I guess I'm trusting that God can do what I can do in 7 and 6, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
So just giving up my workhorse mentality. I guess it brings me to my next question, which is, what exactly is Sabbath rest? Some people might think I'm just going to turn my emails off for the day, or I might take a nap. But what does it look like to really intentionally live into that rest that God invites us into?
Yeah, that's a great question. Because it might include taking a nap, right?
Totally.
Sleep
it does for
is
me.
So biblical.
Right.
We sleep. And that's how God restores us every day. Turning off our emails, probably a good thing for Sabbath. So it could, the kind of rest that we intentionally put together probably would include some of those things. The word Sabbath literally means to cease, to stop. So we're invited to stop for a day. And stop what? What are we supposed to stop? And I write this list of words because I think these are great words. Like, here's what we are supposed to stop.
Okay.
So you can think about, okay, what does this mean for me? So we stop working, producing, striving, managing, organizing, doing, fixing, earning, completing, forcing, controlling, and consuming. So that's what we stop.
The word doing really stands out to me.
Okay.
Stop doing.
Stop doing.
Because sometimes I use Sundays, and I know a lot of people can relate to this as like, oh, it's laundry day. Because if I do really have that picture in my mind of this is preparing for the week forward, or for the week coming up, I need to get, my life together, right? Like I have to have my laundry done. I have to clean. I have to meal prep if you do that kind of thing.
Yeah.
I'm really bad at it. I'm acting like I have my life together, but I don't.
Sounds good.
So the word doing really sticks out to me in that. But all of those things, yeah.
And so in that, when you talk about intentionality, like to be able to take a day where we stop those things means we've had to think ahead, right? Because those things still have to be done. And so when are they going to get done
right.
if they're not going to get done on that day? But when I think, okay, so if we're stopping those things, what are we entering into? What is the day supposed to be like? And so the word list I've come up with that. So on a Sabbath rest, we worship, we receive, sleep, play, revive, feast, listen, respond, trust, and let go. And I will add back from Genesis, with God. So there's a way to rest, I suppose, where God's maybe not involved, but the intentionality is we're honoring and resting and worshiping and responding with God who rests with us. So those are kind of abstract ideas. What does it actually look like? That's the fun part, is that there's, other than maybe the gathered community coming together in worship, which was a anchor point for the Jewish Sabbath. Like, it wasn't just go do your own thing. There was a gathered worship as part of the Sabbath. So that we wanted, that's part of the Sabbath day. But then there's just lots of creativity. What revives you? What gives you life? Who are the people that pour into you, that you love being around? What do you recreate with? What do you play? What do you love to do? So
question for you.
Yeah.
In that, going back to your idea of family day.
Yeah.
When did you make that switch in your head, like, oh, this really is Sabbath, and it's a beautiful thing to enter into all of these restful things with people? Because you said it's part of, Jewish Sabbath was gathering in worship, but you all are gathering as a family throughout the day.
Right. So I think I understood the concept of Sabbath growing up in church. I think the first big shift for me was when I went to college, no longer living with my family, having to make decisions on my own about, am I going to go to a church? I got to find a church. Yes, find a church. But and then am I going to study on Sunday? Because, now I'm in college. So had a Bible study I was part of, and we all wrestled with this together, making commitments. We're going to try to make Sunday holy, even here in college. Now, did we do it perfectly? No. But we thought about it, and we engaged in it, and we tried. And then as a young adult, same kinds of things, first job, working. Is Sunday, is the day of worship a day of rest? Is that going to continue? How does that look? And then probably the most work I've done on it is after having kids who, tend to sort of wreck the Sabbath. Just kidding, they don't. But it becomes really different because now you have people responsible, or you're responsible for little ones, and they're not very quiet, and they're not very restful. And so as a family now, we have gone through different seasons of what does it mean to be thinking about Sabbath as a family. And you go through different stages of kids when they're real little. Our kids are teenagers now, so they're actually, they're part of the discussion. What is Sabbath going to look like for us as a family?
That's beautiful. I love that so much.
Yeah.
It's funny that you say you're starting to introduce Sabbath as a family and see what each individual in the family wants to get out of that and how they're going to walk with God in that. And, right here, we're looking at our notes, and it's in Exodus, Moses is introducing the rhythm of Sabbath to the people of God. It says, verse 26, or Exodus 16:26 says, 6 days you are to gather it, but on the seventh day, the Sabbath, there will not be any. So again, that trusting posture.
Yeah, and that story is the first time that Moses introduces this concept of Sabbath. So the people of Israel have been pulled out of Egypt. They're becoming the people of Israel under Moses' direction, and they're hungry, and they want to go back to Egypt, and God provides food for them. You probably know the story, the manna on the ground, and he says, every day go out and gather the manna, and there'll be enough for the day. Just gather enough for the day, right? So, give us this day our daily bread. So, but don't collect any extra, because if you do and try to store it, it will rot. But for 6 days, you're going to go out each day and gather just what you need. And then on that seventh day, he introduces this idea of Sabbath, that you're not going to go out and work and gather manna. You're going to have enough on day 6. You're going to gather a little extra. It will keep, and that's what you're going to eat on the seventh day. And so because it's a Sabbath day of the Lord. So he begins by introducing that concept. Now, the interesting thing is also how it's connected with worship is God rescues the people through Moses, and Moses is taking them to the desert to worship. So they're going to learn how to worship. And so along the way, they begin this Sabbath rhythm. I think it's in chapter 19 is when they have this first worship experience at the mountain with God. And then Exodus 20, where the 10 Commandments come in, and Sabbath shows up as commandment number 4, which is pretty high on the list of commandments, right? And so they're learning, they're getting trained, right, in how to be God's people. And so so Sabbath being number 4, the first 3 commands are about worship the Lord your God only, don't make an image, don't take the Lord's name in vain. And then number 4 is Sabbath, and there's almost this sense of there's no way that you're going to be able to do commandments 1, 2, and 3 if there's not a Sabbath day given for you to understand that, this is all about God. And so it's really important. In fact, one author, Mark Buchanan, who y'all should read his book called The Rest of God, says, if we don't keep the Sabbath, we will die. Right, big
morbid,
and right, and he says, but not today or tomorrow, but over time, if we don't have the rest that we need, it will chip away at our soul slowly over time, and eventually, the pace of life, the not resting, not worshiping, not being who we're supposed to be, it will kill us. And I mean, you know that, right? I mean, when we don't rest,
We go crazy.
we
a
go
little
crazy.
bit.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I love what you said about you can't really be attentive to the first 3 commandments without the 4th. I think that's just kind of a baseline way to view Christianity in general, right? Because if God has grace, why wouldn't we just do all these other things, that are pleasing to the flesh? But being in relationship with God actually makes you want to yearn for the good rather than using it as an excuse to do the bad.
Yeah, it's good.
Does that make sense?
Yeah,
and so I
That's
love
good.
how you're saying they all work in tandem with each other. But with that, for our listeners, I'm sure we'd love to hear from you how someone who hasn't necessarily incorporated Sabbath into their life, how do you get started? And what if someone doesn't have a whole day to dedicate to Sabbath practice?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I would say start small.
Okay.
Right, start small. So if you haven't practiced a 24-hour Sabbath, that's a lot.
Big deal.
So I would say, just go look at your schedule, like lay it out and say if I were to take a block of time to unhook from work, to rest, to do something life-giving, where would that go? Where would I even put it? And if maybe it's only 2 hours somewhere in the week, maybe it's 3, maybe it's a half a day. Just start small. And you can always grow it and expand it. And I think the other thing about our life and our pace of life now is that it's not always Sunday that can be that expanded day. People work on Sundays. I mean, it's just kind of, there's a lot. And so I might say, make sure you have your time for worship. Got to be part of the gathered people of God. That's really important. But if your Sabbath rest can't extend off that time, find another time in the week where the rest, and God's bigger than schedules. So start small. Start with just a simple practice of what brings you life. Maybe it's going on a walk with a friend. I walk my dog. That's really life-giving to me. So I talk about how with other people about I walk my dog every day like that. We both need it. It's really good for us. But on my Sabbath day, which happens to be Friday because I'm a pastor and work on Sunday, that's another conversation. I let my dog walk me on Sabbath. So 6 days of the week, I'm in control of getting my dog. I have 30 minutes. We're walking. We're getting home. I have things to do. But on my Sabbath day, I have a shift. I'm letting Winston walk me. And that releases my control from the situation. And so the walk will take a lot longer because dogs, they'll wander and do their own thing.
Right.
And that's what, for me, that brings up all the control issues I have of, I have so much to do, and I can hear God's voice in the background saying, it's your Sabbath day. What is more important than sitting here on this grass with your dog, relaxing, and breathing?
One of the words that you brought up in, you had a list of words for what we stopped and then what we start. And one of the things that you put, I think you ended with it, was let go. Yeah. And that's kind of what you're doing with your dog. You're letting go of the control. Yeah. I think discipline is something that we've almost put negatively in our head, like work, when you wake up, when you sleep, when you eat. But it's a discipline to rest even. Yeah. Like you have to train your mind and posture your heart to rest, and discipline in that sense might look like not having the control or the discipline over your dog,
Right. It's a simple,
small things.
Yeah, it's a simple discipline, but it gets at that control issue, and there may be, other things that give you life. So maybe it's cooking a meal and inviting friends over. Maybe it's journaling or reading or just something that brings you life. Yeah.
And right here, another biblical reference for you guys is Acts 16:13-15.
Oh, yeah.
Story of a Sabbath day with Paul and Lydia.
Yeah. I love that. I love this story. So there's this little story in Acts 16 where we learn that it's the Sabbath day, and Paul, of course, keeps the Sabbath. So he is in a city where there isn't a synagogue, so he's going to look for worshipers. And in that time, if you didn't worship in the synagogue, the river was often the place where you would find people praying. So the story tells us that he leaves the town, he goes to the river to look for a place of prayer. And he finds Lydia and some friends there, and they're there to pray, they're worshipers. And so learning from the story, Paul is keeping Sabbath. He's leaving the city on the Sabbath day, which to me represents leaving the daily work behind to go find a space to pray. He's speaking with this gathered group. And what I love about this passage is if you just look at the verbs in this passage, and our listeners can go read the scripture, Acts 16, 13 to 15, but just looking at the verbs of Sabbath, I love this, kind of what highlights. Went outside to the river, looking for a place of prayer, sat down, spoke with the gathered group, listened. God opened hearts, responded, baptized, and then come and stay. Those are some of the verbs that are part of Sabbath. So we listen, we respond, we sit down, we see who's around us, we take space and slowness, and it says that God opened their hearts. Paul shares the gospel with that group, and God opens their hearts, and there's response, and they're baptized. And then out of that, Lydia invites Paul and the little group to come back and to stay at her house. So there's hospitality and relationship that come in. So it's just this little story, but about a Sabbath day in the life of Paul, but so rich with what actually happens on a Sabbath day.
Yeah, that's beautiful. I think so often I'm an extrovert, clearly.
Yeah.
And I think that Sabbath is supposed to be this treacherous, introverted time that I have to really get uncomfortable with. But I realize if it truly is what's restful to me, entering into relationship with people and being around people can be part of it. Yes. Yeah. The time alone is important, and I love to, read a devotional or go on a walk or paint or do anything that is life-giving. But the hospitality part, or just doing life with one another and listening to other people, is so life-giving too. And so that kind of restructures my mindset on it personally.
Yeah, being with people is really a big part of Sabbath. And in the Jewish Sabbath, there's meals and there's worship and community life happens on Sabbath. It just might, like you were saying, it's a mind shift of serving one another and listening and being open and sharing. Yeah, that's amazing.
And you said growing up you had this family day. Now you're learning with your kids. Yeah. What it's like to practice Sabbath together. Is their Sabbath day on Friday as well?
So good question. No, because they go to school and Adam works. But so the shift though is when they were younger, Saturday was the day that we tried to practice Sabbath. I'm always going to say we strive. We're never, it's a hard practice.
Trying. Yeah.
So recently we've had this conversation again because they're teenagers. They do a lot of stuff on Saturday. And my son, Henry, said, it has to be Sunday, Mom. It just has to be Sunday. And for me, I'm like, well, I work on Sunday, but I have Friday, so absolutely, we're going to do a family Sabbath on Sunday. And so we've been shifting from then Saturday night to Sunday evening. So worship is right there in the center of it, but they don't have as much going on Sundays. So, but here's what I will say, and I don't know if this will help our listeners, but we landed on as a family 3 things that we do on our Sabbath, and they can be in any order. They can happen at any time during that 24-hour period. But as a family, we decided the 3 things that we want to do are, 1, read real books. So off screens, everyone has a real book they have to read.
Copy.
Yeah, when they were younger, we read together. Now they're older, we all have our own books. But there has to be a reading time. The second thing is an activity or a family walk or a family game, something that, something fun that we do, and the different kids can pick what it is. And then the third thing is during that 24-hour period, at least one family meal. And we can invite others into that, but our family has to have a family, so it could be breakfast, lunch, dinner, but we're going to eat together one time during our Sabbath day, and we are going to pray together at that meal. So that is what we have mapped out as the activities that we do together for Family Sabbath.
Thanks for sharing that.
Yeah.
I love that so much. Right here, I see that you've referenced God in my everything.
Yeah.
Can you tell me
so there's
a little bit about that?
So there's a couple books out there that I might recommend, and God in My Everything is by Ken Shigematsu. Actually, Pastor Tim recommended this book for me. It's really great. He talks very practically and very accessibly about putting together a rule of life, which is sort of a whole rhythm, but Sabbath is a big part of it. And a quote from him that I like to use is just talking about how we're creating a rhythm or an ecosystem for growth, for God to grow in our lives. So he says deliberate practice is necessary for a runner or a musician to grow. In order for a person to grow in a craft, she or he must create an ecosystem, an environment that fosters growth. In order to thrive in our life with God, we need a spiritual ecosystem that includes deliberate practice. And as you think about the rhythms that you're creating or that we're creating in our lives that bring us close to God, that help us to grow spiritually, he talks about these things need to be practiced. Like if you would practice an instrument to get better, we also have to practice spiritual disciplines. And Sabbath is one of those that just practice it, right? Like it's not going to be perfect, but just give it a shot. And when God creates the world, he puts Sabbath every week. So we get to practice Sabbath every week, and worship is every week. It's a weekly rhythm for us. Other spiritual practices like journaling, different kinds of prayer, you might, like I for different seasons in a year, I might change those things up a little bit. Like in the fall, I do a lot of journaling, and in winter, I don't know, I drink coffee and I pray because it's cold. But Sabbath is not one you ever rotate out. Yeah. No, it's the anchor of the ecosystem is the Sabbath, and worship is the anchor of Sabbath. So those are not things we rotate out. Sabbath and worship as part of Sabbath are the weekly rhythm that keep us growing this ecosystem. So that's what I love about what Shigematsu writes about in God in My Everything. And then just a couple other resources that might be helpful. Ruth Haley Barton, anything she writes, but particularly Sacred Rhythms is a great starting point of spiritual practices. There's a chapter on Sabbath that's really good. And in the fall, I'll teach a class on with using that book, and we'll do a lot of work on Sabbath. Mark Buchanan, The Rest of God is his book on Sabbath. He talks about Sabbath being a day and a posture of the heart, so I want to get that in before we finish. It is a 24-hour period. It's also, Sabbath is a posture of our heart. A Sabbath day feeds a Sabbath rhythm so that we find God throughout the week in lots of ways. So it's not only a 24-hour. It's a way of life, a Sabbath way of life. And then Susan Phillips writes a book called The Cultivated Life, and a great chapter on Sabbath in there too. So
thank you so much for those resources. I'll be sure to check them out. Listeners, if you all are able to check them out, you should let me or Jennifer know.
Absolutely.
But that does about wrap up our time. Thank you so much, Jennifer, for joining us. Hopefully we'll get to hear more from you in the coming weeks.
Thanks, Liza.
And if you're enjoying these conversations on faith and life, please be sure to leave us a review so that more people can find this podcast, and we'd love for you to join with us in the conversation. If there's a topic that you'd like for us to discuss, send an email to podcasts@firstprescos.org. Or if you're watching the video version on YouTube, be sure to leave a comment below. And we'll look forward to seeing you in the next episode when we discuss missions with our missions director, Greg Zaloom. Thanks again for listening, and we'll see you in 2 weeks.